Today we're gonna make 100% whole wheat sourdough bread. This recipe is for 2 loaves of bread.
The shortcuts we use in our whole wheat sourdough recipe save so much time that it's kind of crazy that more people aren't sharing them. Our whole wheat sourdough recipe is so simple that anyone can make it without needing fancy tools or learning fancy techniques. We'll be showing you these shortcuts throughout this video, right up until the very end. We start with a very active whole wheat sourdough starter. For this recipe, we use a lot of starter. We do this because you need more starter when using whole wheat flour. Add the starter to a large plastic container. Save a spoonful of starter for next time. You can also make this recipe with regular yeast. Let us know in the comments if you'd like to see how. Add water and salt and mix with a spoon until all the starter and salt have dissolved. You won't have to do any kneading for this recipe. Add the flour. Whole wheat flour is higher in protein than all-purpose flour. This bread has very high hydration. In other words, it's very moist. So moist that it melts in your mouth. When we buy whole wheat bread in bakeries, we notice that it's much drier than this bread.
Our recipe is much better.
Mix in the flour until it's incorporated. It only takes a minute or two. Cover and let rest for 45 minutes. Don't forget to feed the starter that you set aside at the beginning. It's very warm and humid in our place these days. So rather than leaving the dough on the counter like we normally would, we'll put it in the fridge after each time we fold and stretch.
If we don't do this, the dough will ferment too quickly.
And the loaf may not rise properly. To prevent sticking, wet your hands before each time you work the dough. Because this dough is high hydration, it will be a little trickier to manage the first time you stretch and fold it. Lift from one of the corners and stretch and fold. Lift and stretch and fold from every side of the container. If you see any large air bubbles, pop them to avoid having any large holes in your bread. Do each side a couple of times. The folding and stretching helps the gluten to develop and strengthens the dough. Place in the fridge for 45 minutes. You'll stretch and fold 4 times at 45-minute intervals. Wet your hands and stretch and fold just like last time. Each time you work the dough after taking it out of the fridge, you flip the dough so the seam is on top. Stretch and fold from each side. The process is similar each time, but the dough feels more elastic as you progress. Each time you finish stretching and folding, the dough will be firmer. Flip to put the seam on the bottom before returning the dough to the fridge.
Sarah, do we have another one like this?
Seriously? They're very hard to find, you know. Vintage Pyrex made in USA. They don't come in tubes. Sorry. At least these two are both transparent. Using these glass loaf pans saves you the cost of buying a bread basket and Dutch oven. We picked these up at a thrift store for $2 each, but any large store with kitchen supplies should have them. We highly recommend using glass loaf pans because they last longer than metal ones.
And they work better too.
Add a drop of oil and spread it around on both dishes. Remove the dough from the fridge and add a bit of water so it doesn't stick to the counter. Take it out and flip it so the seam is on top. Now cut it in half. If you want the halves to be exactly the same size, you can weigh them. Now roll the dough, again checking for air bubbles and popping any you find. Fold the corners inwards and roll to make a cylinder. With the outside of your hand, push under the roll to make it as tight as possible, and push each time you roll, like this. If you like this video, please help us out by giving us a like. We really appreciate it. Lift the loaf and place it into the loaf pan with the seam down. Another great thing about using glass loaf pans instead of a Dutch oven is that you can bake 2 loaves at a time, or even 3. Do the same thing with the other loaf and do another check for air bubbles, popping any you find. Place in a plastic bag and refrigerate for 8 to 10 hours. Preheat the oven to 480 degrees Fahrenheit. Take out the bread and remove the plastic bag. Check one last time for air bubbles and pop any you find. Don't worry about the smaller bubbles on the side, because these show that the dough is fermenting. With this method, you don't need to proof the bread by having it sit out for an hour or more.
It goes directly into the oven. You don't even need to score it.
It's easy as pie. Actually, easier than pie. If you used a Dutch oven rather than the glass loaf pans, you'd have to heat the Dutch oven in the oven for an hour before you even bake it.
So our method also cuts energy costs.
You can also damage your Dutch oven by using it to bake bread. See? Place the loaves in the oven and reduce the temperature to 450 degrees Fahrenheit.
Bake for 20 minutes.
After 20 minutes, turn the temperature down to 420 degrees Fahrenheit.
Bake for another 20 minutes.
Remove the loaves from the oven. Aren't they beautiful? Check the temperature. It should be about 199 degrees Fahrenheit or 93 degrees Celsius. If it's lower than that, bake for another 5 minutes. If you don't have a thermometer, insert a toothpick, and if it comes out clean, the bread is ready. Let the bread cool for at least 45 minutes before removing it from the mold. Now it's time to remove the bread from the dish. Cut around the edges, then insert a spatula and press up to free the bottom. We love our wooden spatula. This sourdough bread came out perfectly. It's incredibly moist and soft, but a bit crunchy on the outside. This is much better than a whole wheat sourdough bread you'd typically get at a store or even at a bakery. Because the bread is soft, it's a bit of a struggle to slice. We have a trick to avoid this. We put our bread in a bag and freeze it for about 4 hours before slicing. This way it's much easier to slice evenly. We always store our bread in the freezer because it stays nice and fresh that way. We just use it as we need it, and we never have to worry about it drying out. Enjoy your delicious and healthy whole wheat sourdough bread. We hope you found our shortcuts helpful. If you liked our whole wheat sourdough recipe, we think you'll enjoy this recipe too.